Hello, my fellow fallible humans. My name is Tanya McIntyre. I'm an addiction recovery facilitator, a recovery coach, so to speak, with SMART. And I'm also the co-founder of Red Roof Recovery. Red Roof Recovery is an addiction recovery program that softens the path of recovery from substance and behavioral addictions. Red Roof Recovery is founded on what has worked for me in my sustainable recovery. The operative word is sustainable. And that is the principles around CBT, cognitive behavioral therapies. I was introduced to CBT by yet another acronym, SMART, Self-Management and Recovery Training. That's an alternative recovery path to the more common 12-step programs that we hear about and are used in many rehab facilities. In fact, when I checked into rehab way back in 2009, the only model of recovery available was the 12-step program of Al-Anon, AA. AA saved my life, and SMART gave me my life back. There are literally hundreds of tools of recovery to choose from, but we have been conditioned as a society to think that we have to follow a program to have any level of success in recovery. For many years, 12-step programs were the only recovery programs available. So I am thrilled to see programs like SMART. It's a nonprofit organization in Ohio, and SMART is growing internationally now with their more secular approach, science evidence-based addiction recovery. On today's episode of Red Roof Recovery, I am joined by Doug Pryor, a psychologist from Michigan, and he's now practicing in Ontario, Canada. Thank you so much for being here, Doug. I really appreciate it. I'm very interested to learn about your experience as a certified addictions counselor, because you're a certified addictions counselor in the state of Michigan and also in all of Canada?
Correct.
Yeah.
I'm what's called a registered, that's right. We're only certified.
Certified.
They're seeking to become registered, but yeah, I'm a certified addictions counselor in Canada.
So what kinds of things have you recognized as the big differences in addiction recovery on each side of the border?
Well, I'm kind of new. I'm an immigrant from Michigan, and we did not become full-time here until July of 2019. And then so I started working with Roseanne under her direction and supervision back in approximately the late summer of 2020 after COVID had quieted a little bit. And so I'm just becoming more familiar with the differences between Canadian and Michigan approaches. Speaking of Michigan approaches, most of what I did was funded either through the state of Michigan and or through managed care. And that would be private insurances like Blue Care Network. My apologies, I almost slipped. Or Blue Cross Blue Shield or HAP or Select Care. These were some of the funders of treatment that I had encountered when I was working in Michigan. Most of those funders, they pretty much set the expectations as far as what they were willing to pay for. And the primary approach that they wanted to authorize would be mostly cognitive behavioral principles.
Interesting.
And we were expected to provide very elaborate behavioral cognitive plans. In fact, when I worked residential treatment, which was a 9-year stint, we had a 6-page treatment plan. And then another page of review that we had to do with our clients while they were with us for anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks. And it was very defined. We had to present, measurable goals and objectives. We had to provide some kind of observations as to was there any forward movement. So we had to know the jargon of cognitive behavioral therapy.
Jargon, interesting word.
Well, and the big buzzword was evidence-based practices.
Yes.
Now, I'll be honest, I'm a little bit cynical because one of the things I noticed is there was a lot of workshops we had to take to keep our certifications up in the state of Michigan. And I witnessed a lot of people who claim to have come up with new treatment practices of evidence-based treatment. Now, mind you, I've been taking psychology classes since I started college way back in 1970. I've learned the primary theorist, nothing really has changed since Ellison came out with his goodie bag of rational emotive therapy,
right?
RET.
REBT,
or something like
I
that.
think is the...
I have forgotten the initials.
Yeah.
It's been so long. And as such, it's like, oh, you're just doing a new twist on an old gig.
Exactly.
But there have been some practices that I have seen that have intrigued me and have caught my attention. DBT.
DBT, I was just going to say,
dialectical behavioral therapy, which, by the way, I don't know if anybody knows this, it was developed by a psychologist who self-recognized that she was a borderline personality and had that particular condition. And she molded CBT with Buddhistic principles of meditation and self-regulation.
Nice.
Blended it together, and voila, we have DBT.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one that intrigued me, and I did a lot of training in, was motivational interviewing, which was based not only on CBT, but also a lot of Rogerian principles, and trying to help a client clarify, where are you in terms of your willingness to make changes in your life?
Yeah.
And there was a lot of respect and a lot of working with where the client was at that I saw much more apparent in MI, or motivational interviewing, than I necessarily saw in CBT.
I agree. Yeah.
So
I think there's something to be said for asking the right questions at the right time.
Correct. And assessing where is the client.
Yeah.
And I saw that much more so there than the baseball bat of CBT, which, we kind of had to clobber our clients with. And sometimes I had questions about, but where's the client?
Right.
And I'm very much into client-centered therapy, not just as a demanded practice by the funder, but also as an effective therapeutic tool that basically has been around since Freud started. He just didn't call it that.
Right. So Albert Ellis is considered kind of the father of cognitive therapies.
Yes.
Or would it be Aaron Beck? I don't know who came first.
I think Beck came later, and that's when he developed his tools for assessing depression. And I remember studying Beck because we had one of my trainings was in the Rorschach. And Beck had a whole series of things, I believe. I may be misstating myself, but I believe he had a whole bunch of stuff that was very, very well organized and very mathematical as far as how to interpret those ink blots. Not that I've ever used them since I finished my internship, but it was kind of fun doing that. So
excellent. Are you familiar with Dr. David Burns?
Burns.
Dr. David Burns, he wrote
now, I know of Burns.
Yeah.
And the one I'm familiar with is I'm okay, you're okay, and that was called transactional analysis. Are we talking about the same Burns?
I don't think so. David Burns, he was a student of Albert Ellis, and he went on to become a pioneer in something called team therapy. So he's taken cognitive behavioral therapy and he's kind of just given it a bit of steroids.
Okay.
Right?
No, that one I'm not familiar with.
So that's another acronym. That is TEAM. So T, and you've kind of made a point of how important it is, I think, for someone in therapy to not only establish a relationship with their patient and empathize with them from where they are and help them get to where they want to be, but to also test whether or not you're being effective at the end of every session. And that's what David Burns said. He said, I've talked to a lot of psychiatrists who think that they're doing really well with their clients, and then the client will leave and commit suicide. So we need to test ourselves with the patients to say, am I providing you with what you need? And I think that was a wonderful development, I think, is what we really need more of, is for the doctor to say, and are you getting what you need here at the end of our session? But our system is broken too, Doug, because Dr. Gabor Mate, one of my favorite Canadian doctors, He worked in Vancouver's East Side, which is said to be, I think, the most highly populated, densely populated, addicted population in North America. And he worked in that population for 12 years. And he said, there's no time. We've got universally funded healthcare that doesn't allow the time that we need. When I've got a 5-year-old coming to me with asthma, I don't have time to say, why is a 5-year-old stressed? All I can do is write a prescription for a stress hormone puffer and say, good luck, see you later. So those restrictions, I think, in health care are very frustrating. So I like David's approach where he said, okay, let's do testing, empathy, agenda setting, and method. So we'll test at the end of every session to see where we're going, if we need to switch it up. The empathy, really important. And also asking the patient, if is this enough? Have we done enough work on this? Do you think we've talked about empathy enough? Do we need to go a little deeper? It takes time, though. And that's the challenge, the time.
Well, you're proposing something that sounds familiar. It just, I don't think I've ever been trained in that particular approach.
Well, I think it's just a template, isn't it? I think you're trained. I think it's just being a psychologist, you're trained.
Well, what had happened is my training was you constantly are assessing your client. We define the first session as the assessment session, which to me is amusing because all I'm doing is getting the talking points. And I may get a lot of talking points and a lot of information behind them, but each session is an assessment, which motivational interviewing starts on that approach too, that we are having an interview. And in that interview, we're having a conversation. And in that conversation, the focus is, where is the client and how do we move them towards change? And where are they at in the stages of change? So as a therapist, I'm constantly reviewing that. I'm constantly looking at that, determining where is this person, where are we headed, and what do I need to be aware of as far as my focus? So I guess under my MI training, we've done sort of that.
Yeah.
Probably not in the structured manner as what you're talking about, though, or at least as that method under teams.
I've been a facilitator with SMART, Self-Management and Recovery Training. That organization, it's a nonprofit organization, volunteer-driven. And I've been a certified facilitator with SMART since 2018. And the acronym with SMART is Self-Management and Recovery Training. So we talk a lot about cognitive therapies, motivational interviewing, and we do something called Stages of Change with people who are attending our meetings. And there are, I believe, 5 or 6 pre-contemplation.
6.
6.
5 going up and 1 going down.
So pre-contemplation is, don't bug me, I don't have a problem.
Well, yeah, I don't have a problem. So most of our work is then clarifying consequences and doing some education. The next is contemplation. I have a vague idea that something's not right. And so our work is further clarifying, well, what is it that's off? What is it that doesn't seem right? And also some education on that. And also some contrasting, what doesn't seem right and what do you want? The next one is planning, where we start brainstorming ideas of where do we want to go with our change. And then the next one is the action stage, where we actually put into place some of the things out of our plan. And then the next one is reviewing. Is it working? Mm-hmm. How is it working? Can it be tweaked? And then the last one is, the review, I should say, is review and maintenance. Maintenance. But the last one is what happens if there's a relapse, or in the psychodynamic phrase, regression, stepping backwards. And that happens. And then how do we pick up from there? How do we examine what went wrong? Where did we get off track? Yeah. In SMART, they differentiate between a relapse and a lapse. And I like that. I also like the fact that SMART discourages the use of labels. So we are very aware of how we're using our language. Mm-hmm. So we don't use terms like substance abuse or substance abuser or addict or alcoholic. So we use terms like substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, someone suffering with
addiction. We're not an addict. We are not our behavior. So I like that about SMART. There's something empowering around that, I think, because I spent 9 years in 12-step programs and I was relapsing every year or two.
Can I throw in a word here? You used the word relapse and lapse.
Yes.
Actually, the word that I had heard, there's a relapse and then there's a prolapse. And the relapse is falling backwards. The prolapse is falling forward. Because one of the things I've realized is that oftentimes when somebody relapses, and I use that word loosely, typically it's because they're stuck on one of the stages of recovery. See, that's another thing that people may not be aware of, is that recovery has stages.
Absolutely.
And the first stage is obviously addressing the main issue, whatever it is that's got our attention in the foreground. But oftentimes, whatever our hang up is, all right, wherever we're stuck in our growth path, what happens is that we're stuck because there's a lot of background stuff going on. And the relapse, if it's thoroughly examined, and if it helps us to understand, well, where am I at in my recovery process? That may be an illumination that's very necessary that allows us to move forward, to fall forward. And if you know anything about walking is a whole process of falling forward. And so the relapse, if properly examined, properly looked at, it can be the basis where a whole new doorway of growth can happen.
Yeah, I agree.
So I just wanted to clarify that. And then lapse, well,
it's a lapse of judgment. It's like thinking I can have just one.
Well, usually that lapse of judgment, again, it is reflecting something in our recovery, in our growth program, our growth process that we are not looking at.
I love that term, growth process.
See, another thing about recovery, if I may dwell on this for a minute.
Absolutely.
I'm going to go Rogerian here. Rogers was of the strong opinion that everybody seeks growth. Everybody seeks forward motion. At least I think Rogers did, if I vaguely remembered. And as such, we're looking at where are people stuck. And I used to explain this to my clients. And living in northern Michigan, the rivers were very important, and there was a lot of kayaking and canoeing that went on the rivers. So I was able to use the image of the river. You know, life is like a river. You're flowing, and sometimes you get stuck. And if you've ever canoed down a river, you might be aware of branches and other debris that collects, and you may not see it, but your canoe or your kayak gets trapped in it. And so our work is to help you get unstuck, how to get back on the flow, and how to move forward using the current of the river and moving beyond whatever is holding you back. And I see therapy a lot of times as being that process.
I love that metaphor of the river. Absolutely. And I use the garden. Let's treat our mind like a garden, because we spend more time talking to ourselves in our head than we talk to anyone. So it's worth the effort to make it a nice place to be. And if we consider gardening, that metaphor of gardening, that when we plant good seeds with good habits and good people, places, and things, and then we do regular weeding, like avoiding the people or the events, circumstances that are going to bring us away from what we say we want, that seeding and weeding process, if we just kind of continue with that in mind, I think it's helpful to keep the recovery path a little smoother. Because you're right, it's flow. We need to just keep flowing, flux and flow.
Well, you're also highlighting the fact that a garden is something that is constantly attended to.
Right.
I'm reminded of a movie I once saw years ago. It was Peter Sellers' last movie called Being There. And Chauncey was this butler who basically inherited the guy who was working for all of his stuff. And Chauncey, if you looked at him, you would kind of diagnose him as mentally challenged. But somehow he had this incredible wisdom. And he talked about the garden. It was some talk show that they had him on. Everybody was raving about it because of the simplicity of it. He was kind of like a precursor of Forrest Gump and The Wise Fool, which has all kinds of very symbolic meaning within growth and spirituality literature. But again, that concept of the garden, and we are constantly tending it. We're constantly working with it.
Yeah.
And when you stop working on it, it goes to seed, it goes to weed, it no longer is
It's stuck.
Yes.
It doesn't flourish.
Yes.
Yeah.
Key word is flourish.
Absolutely. The most crucial predictor of recovery, and I heard this from Dr. David Burns, the most crucial predictor of recovery is having a persistent willingness to exert consistent efforts to help yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that garden metaphor kind of fits in there too. It's a daily process.
Yes.
So let's look at the some of the tools that are used, because my introduction to SMART recovery back in 2018, I was so enamored with it, I became a facilitator within 3 months of attending meetings. And I love all their acronyms because it helps me remember things. And I think repetition is key for learning for me. And they use something called the HOV. And this was something that was based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs primarily, but then it was, I guess, transitioned to recovery by Dr. Joe Gerstein. So Dr. Gerstein is one of the founding presidents of SMART. So the hierarchy of values encourages us to actually sit down and define what it is that we want. What do we consider our core values in life? And a lot of times, I've never been encouraged to do that at any other time in my life before I was introduced to SMART. And it's helpful for people to sit with it because I don't know about you, Doug, but I wasn't encouraged to ever formulate what it is I wanted. I was told that I was put on earth to provide and perform. And it wasn't really important what I wanted. It was that you expected to be staying in school, get a good job, get a car, get the house, have kids, and you just kind of progress through life.
So you're talking about the social values that you grew up with.
Yeah, well, we're born into social,
Yes.
cultural
Yes.
values, and those expectations are pretty high for a lot of people. They were for me. And, I pursued a vocation because I thought it would make my father proud. Wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do, but what I wanted to do was poo-pooed by my family as being, a glorified whatever, right? It was labeled as being not good enough.
So one of the fascinating things you're doing is you're highlighting the value systems. But the other thing you're highlighting, and this is something that I will take a strong look at, is family systems and social class systems. And family systems and class systems generate values that are embraced by the inhabitants. And therefore, the question is, what kinds of values might be unhealthy, and they reflect an unhealthy dynamic? And on the other hand, what kinds of values are healthy, and they reflect a healthy system? Or maybe you might have to look for a healthy social circle to enhance those values.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so some of the work that I will do is clarifying, what's your environment? What did you grow up with? I think what intrigued me especially is how many of my clients grew up in very unhealthy family systems.
Yes, those socioeconomic conditions are.
Well, one of the things that very much intrigued me, well, I should go back. My first degree was a BA in sociology. And the last classes I took was in social conflict and class systems, and how the hierarchy of the systems determine where the goods flow. Now, that may sound very, very almost Marxist, and it may sound very dry. And the question is, what has this got to do with treatment? Then I stumbled across the work of Claudia Black and Sharon Wexscheider Cruz. And they talked about dysfunctional family systems and how the most toxic member of the family system gets all the resources of the system. And that leaves a legacy amongst the family members. And of course, that drew me into a long and very productive exposure to trauma and trauma therapy and value systems that are extremely distorted because of traumatizing social systems. And so that's another thing we look at. Your values, where did they come from? How are they traumatizing you? How do you move beyond those traumas? Because I do find that substance abuse, that pattern, sometimes it emerges all by itself because of a lifestyle of substance abuse that may be part of our culture. But on the other hand, sometimes a pattern of substance abuse emerges as a way of self-medicating. And if we don't examine that, I may end up getting somebody abstinent, but given the right kind of environments, given the right kind of value systems, they could be back using again.
Mm-hmm. Is it helpful for people to define their values? So in
Yes.
SMART, we encourage people to write it down because, you're activating another sense, which...
But now you're also talking about the core approach of logotherapy of Viktor Frankl.
Yes.
Because Viktor Frankl found out if you had a strong enough value, all things being equal, you could survive hell. And he noticed that because he noticed there were some individuals in the concentration camp that he was caught up in that seemed to have a certain amount of resilience that allowed them to survive. And I use the phrase all things being equal, meaning sometimes they might have good values, but if the doctor picks you for the latest experiment, or if the camp guard decides to blow you away or beat you up because they're just in a mood, obviously your value system doesn't count. But he found out that those who didn't necessarily have that, if they had values that were resilient and strong enough, it allowed them to survive. Take that into substance abuse and recovery. Then we work a lot on clarifying what kind of values give you resilience and give you the energy of meaningfulness.
Doug, we could talk at least another half hour.
Easily.
It's gone very, very quickly. Thank you so much for your time. We need to get together and do this again. Perhaps you could be a regular.
I'm available.
We'll talk. All right. Doug Pryor is a psychologist from Michigan and now practicing in Canada's prettiest town of Goderich, Ontario. Thank you so much, Doug.
Thank you.
If you think someone you know, or maybe it's you, who might qualify for Red Roof Recovery's unique program of residential addiction recovery, please email me at redroofrecovery@gmail.com. I've authored a couple of books. They're available at Finchers in the Square in Canada's prettiest town of Goderich, Ontario. You can also get them on Amazon.ca. They are Mindful Wisdom from My Philosopher Dad, Sage Advice from a Single Father. My dad raised me as a single dad in the 60s while struggling with his own addictions, and I wanted to leave a legacy of greatness for him because he was an extraordinary man. And then during the pandemic, I wrote book number 2, a follow-up. This one is Daily Wisdom from My Philosopher Dad, some inspiration to guide your days. I set this one up as a journal, so there's an inspirational message, and I encourage you to reflect on that message, ruminate on it for a while, contemplate. I have found that the power of words is extremely powerful, and the power of the written word can be life transformational. At least it has been for me. Thank you for being here. You are an integral part of my recovery journey, and I appreciate you hanging in here with me. Thanks very much for being here. My name is Tanya McIntyre. May the force be with you. And remember, you are the force.